The list of posts floated in the darkness like a forgotten nail driven into the edge of oblivion. It was small, barely larger than a cargo shuttle, assembled from old steel and even older hopes. It was named Outpost 7, and it was located at the furthest point humanity had ever placed a permanent structure. Behind it, there was nothing explored, nothing charted, nothing known. Only the blackness between stars, stretching out forever. Outpost 7 had listened for 41 years, 41 years of silence, 41 years of recording the hiss and crackle of dying stars, the low hum of pulsars and the empty static noise of a universe that seemed not to care that humanity existed. The 3-member crew was rotated every 8 months, and most of them described the post the same way: boring, lonely, and meaningless. Senior Technician Harun had been at the station for 5 months. She was a quiet woman with short, graying hair and hands that were always busy. She fixed things that didn't need fixing, just to keep from losing her mind. She had stopped believing the station would ever find anything. The universe, she decided, was either empty or too far away to matter. Everything changed on a Tuesday. It was a change that started small. A flicker on the screen, one irregular pulse buried in the background noise of Cygnus Reach. Cora almost missed it. She was eating vacuum-packed noodles and watching the data scroll with half-closed eyes when the pattern caught her attention. She set the noodles aside. She leaned forward. She played the signal again. It repeated not like a natural phenomenon, not like the echo of a collapsing star or the rhythm of a spinning neutron mass. It repeated with structure, with intent. The intervals between the pulses were even. The frequency shifted in steps, following a mathematical sequence. There was no doubt that it was artificial. Cora sat for a very long time, very quietly. Then she called the other 2 crew members. Then they all sat for a very long time, very quietly. Then they sent the data to Earth. The message traveled 11 hours to the nearest relay and another 6 hours to pass through the chain of quantum-entangled communication nodes connecting humanity's 14 star systems. When it reached Earth, it landed on the desk of a junior communications analyst named Rowe, who read it, spilled his coffee, and ran to his supervisor. Within 3 hours, the signal moved up the chain of command from a stained desk in a basement office to the very hall of the High Council of the United Terran Confederation in Geneva. The High Council consisted of 12 people who managed the collective interests of humanity across the galaxy. They were politicians, which meant they were very good at talking and very slow at making decisions. But this time, even they acted quickly. The signal was analyzed, verified, re-verified, and then analyzed again. The mathematics were clear, the structure was clear. Someone out there beyond Cygnus Reach was broadcasting. Humanity was not alone. The news was not released to the public. The Council decided that panic, excitement, or a combination of both would help no one. Instead, they did what governments always did. They developed a plan behind closed doors and chose people they trusted to carry it out. The first person they called was Ambassador Idris Akapor. Akapor was 63, tall, lean, with a face that made people feel that everything would be all right just by clearing his throat. He had spent 30 years talking to people who wanted to kill each other and convincing them not to. He had stopped 2 colonial rebellions without a single shot fired. He had brokered the Kepler Accords, which united 3 warring human factions into a trade alliance that held 12 years later. If there was one living person who could talk to an alien civilization and not make things worse, it was Idris Akapor. He was sitting in his garden on New Carthage. When the call came, he listened to the Council's briefing, asked 7 precise questions, and then said, yes. He packed 1 bag. He kissed his husband goodbye. He boarded a shuttle and left the planet within 4 hours. The second person the Council contacted was Admiral Lena Vaskis. Vaskis was a different kind of tool for a different kind of problem. She was 51. She was compact and carried herself like a blade that had been sharpened too many times. She commanded the UTC's 4th Expeditionary Fleet, 62 warships built for deep space patrol and rapid response. She had fought in the Belt Uprising and the Proximan Insurgency and cleared her throat through the short, ugly war at the Tannhauser Gates. She had never lost a battle and never started one. Her soldiers loved her because she brought them home alive. Her enemies feared her because she was very good at making the alternative to peace terrifying. Vaskis received her orders aboard her flagship, the heavy cruiser Ironclad, while docked at Titan Station near Saturn. She read the briefing twice. The first time with professional interest. The second time with something that might have been anxiety, though she would never admit to it. Her orders were clear. She was to accompany Ambassador Akapor to the source of the signal. She was to ensure security. She was to follow Akapor's instructions in all matters of contact and communication. She was to use force only as a last resort. The Council wanted peace. The Council wanted a handshake across the stars. The Council wanted history to remember this moment as the day humanity found a friend. Vaskis wanted this too, but she had been a soldier long enough to know that wanting something and getting it were very different things. The mission assembled quickly. Akapor's diplomatic cruiser, the Olive Branch, was an elegant white ship designed specifically for high-level negotiations. It had luxurious conference rooms, advanced translation systems, and absolutely no weapons. It was meant to look harmless. It was meant to say without words that the people inside came in peace. Vaskis's fleet followed at a distance, close enough to react if things went wrong, far enough that the aliens wouldn't feel threatened. At least, that was the plan. They set off from Titan Station on a cold Thursday morning. The Olive Branch jumped first. Its FTL drive left a short trail of blue light in the dark. Admiral Vaskis's fleet followed in formation. 62 ships moved like a school of steel fish through the folded space between stars. The journey took 9 days. During those 9 days, UTC intelligence worked around the clock to decrypt more of the alien signal. What they found did not comfort anyone. The signal was not a greeting. It was not hello or welcome or a curious hand reaching out to see who was there. It was a broadcast, automatic, repetitive, and very old. And when linguists and mathematicians finally decoded enough of its structure to understand its meaning, the mood in the intelligence offices shifted from excitement to silence. It was a territorial claim, a border marker, a sign placed on the edge of a foreign yard that read in a language requiring no translation. This space belongs to us. Stay away. The aliens were called the Velet. Their territory was called the Dominion of the Velet Compact, and their signal had been broadcasting for over 2,000 years, long before humanity had even left Earth's atmosphere. Akapor received this information in his cabin aboard the Olive Branch. He read the translation carefully, then read it again. Then he leaned back in his chair and thought for a long time. A territorial claim was not a death sentence. Many civilizations throughout human history had placed warnings on their borders. It was a sign of strength, of identity, a desire to be left alone. It did not necessarily mean the Velet were hostile. It meant they were cautious. It meant they had something they wanted to protect. Akapor had worked with cautious people before. With cautious people, you could negotiate. He sent a message to Admiral Vaskis, outlining his assessment. The Velet were likely a powerful, established civilization. They were territorial, but not necessarily aggressive. The best approach was to openly declare humanity's presence, express peaceful intentions, and request an official meeting. The standard first contact protocol. Slow, careful, respectful. Vaskis read his message on the ironclad's bridge. She respected Akapor. She respected his track record, his intelligence, and his instincts. But she had spent her career learning one simple truth that diplomats often forget. You cannot negotiate with someone who does not see you as a person. And a civilization that had been broadcasting a stay-away sign for 2,000 years might not view a newcomer as something worth negotiating with. She sent a short reply. Understood. We will maintain escort distance. Recommend keeping weapons on standby and shields ready just in case. Akapor agreed to the precaution. It was a reasonable compromise. On the 10th day, they reached the edge of the Velet border. The signal was strong here, pulsing across all frequencies like a heartbeat. Akapor ordered the Olive Branch to broadcast a response on the same frequency. A simple mathematical greeting, followed by a message of peace, translated into the structural language of the signal itself. It was elegant work. The linguists had spent the entire journey crafting it. It said, in essence, "We hear you. We come in peace. We wish to talk." Then they waited. The response came 47 minutes later. It was not words. It was not mathematics. It was a fleet. Sensors on the Olive Branch howled as 40. 2 ships dropped out of FTL in a perfect ring around them. They were massive, angular, dark ships covered in what looked like overlapping scales of black metal. Each was at least twice the size of the Olive Branch. They moved with a precision that spoke of millennia of practice. They were warships, and they were in combat formation. Akapor stood on the bridge and watched as the ring of alien ships tightened around his vessel. His heart beat fast, but his face was calm. He had been in rooms with warlords who held guns to his head. He had smiled at people who were deciding whether to kill him. He wore fear in his chest and never allowed it to reach his hands. He turned to his communications officer. "Open a channel," he said. "All frequencies. Let them know we received their signal and we are here to talk, nothing more." The officer did as commanded. The message went out. The alien ships did not move. They simply hung there, dark and silent like a ring of black teeth ready to snap shut. Then a transmission came through. One voice, deep and resonant, translated through the olive branch's systems into rough, broken sentences. The translation was not perfect, but it was clear enough. "Little being," said the voice, "you have entered the Dominion. You were not invited. You were not called. You stand in the shadow of the Velet Compact, and you will answer for your presence." Akapor straightened his jacket. He had heard worse openings. "We are the people of Earth," he said. His voice was steady and warm. "We received your signal. We come not to invade, not to beg, but to introduce ourselves. We seek only peace and understanding between our peoples." There was a long silence. Then the voice spoke again, and this time there was something in it that Akapor did not like. It was amusement. Not the kind that comes from a good joke, but the kind that comes from watching something small and helpless do something foolish. "Peace," the voice repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it strange. "You speak of peace. You do not know what that word means. Here in the Dominion, peace is simple. It is the silence that comes after obedience." The channel remained open. The 42 ships remained in formation. And for the first time in his long career, Akapor felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, having nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. He had heard that tone before, not from cautious people, not from people who wanted to be left alone. He had heard it from people who believed with absolute certainty that they were better than everyone else in the room. The voice spoke again. This time it was not addressing Akapor. It was addressing its fleet, but the channel remained open, as if the speaker didn't care if the humans heard. "Record this," the voice said. "Another species has crawled to our border and asked for our attention. We will teach them their place, as we have taught all the others." The transmission ended. The ring of ships began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they tightened their formation, closing in on the olive branch like a fist clenching a small white stone. Akapor stood on his bridge and watched them. His crew was afraid. He could hear it in their breathing, see it in the way their hands gripped the consoles. They were diplomats, translators, and scientists. They were not soldiers. They had never been this close to death. Akapor knew with the certainty of 30 years spent reading people across tables and on battlefields that the next few hours would decide everything, not just for his crew, not just for his mission, but for every living human. He kept his calm and sent a short, steady message to Admiral Vaskis, who was still waiting with the fleet beyond sensor range. "Admiral," he said, "I think you should start planning for the worst." Then he turned to face the alien ships, straightened his posture, and prepared to do the only thing he knew how to do. He prepared to talk. However, he didn't yet know that talking would not be enough. The Velet were tall. That was the first thing Ambassador Idris Akapor noticed when the visual link finally established, and he saw them for the first time. They were tall, broad, and built like something that had evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill you, and you had decided to kill it all back. Their skin was dark gray, almost black, and had a faint metallic sheen that caught the light like polished stone. Their faces were long and angular, with deep-set eyes that glowed with a dull amber light and moved with the slow, deliberate focus of predators. Their mouths were wide, lined with something between teeth and mandibles, hard ridges of bone that clicked when they spoke. They wore armor even in what appeared to be their command rooms. Heavy plates of dark metal layered over their chests and shoulders. They did not look like creatures that took their armor off often. They didn't need to. The one speaking to Akapor was their fleet commander, an Archon. His name, as far as the systems could translate, was Corva Jael. He was larger than the others, with deeper lines etched into his face and a pattern of scars on his neck that looked like intentional marks of rank or ritual. He sat in a throne-like chair in the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers standing in rigid posture, and watched the human ambassador as a man might watch an insect that had landed on his plate. "You are small," said Jael. The translation sounded flat and emotionless, but the contempt was clear enough. "Your ship is small. Your words are small. I have crushed species larger than yours before breakfast." Akapor stood in the center of the communication chamber of the olive branch. A wide, circular room designed to project calm and openness. There were no weapons here, no guards. Only Akapor, his senior translator, his adjutant, and a holographic projection system that displayed an image of Jael in full scale. The Archon loomed over them even as a hologram. "Archon Jael," Akapor said, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "I appreciate your willingness to talk with us. We are newcomers to this region of space, and we understand our presence may be unexpected. We come only to introduce ourselves and explore the possibility of peaceful relations between our peoples." Jael stared at him for a moment, then turned to one of his officers and said something in his own language. The officer made a sound that the translator struggled to parse before settling on the nearest human equivalent: laughter, a deep, rumbling laugh. "Peaceful relations," Jael repeated, turning back to Akapor. The words sounded wrong in his mouth, as if they were concepts he had never been asked to consider. "You do not understand where you are, little being. Let me explain to you, since your species is clearly young and ignorant." He leaned forward in his throne, and the hologram shifted with him. His amber eyes drilled into Akapor from the void. "The Velet Compact has ruled this region of the galaxy for 6,000 years. 6,000 years. Your species was still living in earthen huts and hitting each other with rocks when we built our first fleet. Have we not met 43 intelligent species since we came to power? Do you know how many of those species are still free?" He paused, letting the silence do its work. "None," he said. "Every species we have met has bent the knee. Some did it quickly and were rewarded with the honor of serving us. Some resisted and were broken. The few who refused completely no longer exist. That is the law of the Dominion. It is the only law that has ever mattered. The strong rule, the weak serve. There is nothing else." Akapor listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He had heard such speeches before from warlords on distant colonies, from rebel leaders intoxicated by their own power, from petty dictators who thought their strength made them right. The words were always the same. Only the scale changed. "Oh, Archon," Akapor said when Jael finished. "I hear what you say, and I respect the history of your people. 6,000 years is a long time, and the Velet have obviously built something remarkable. But I would like you to consider that the galaxy is large enough for more than one way of doing things. Humanity does not wish to rule you or be ruled by you. We want to stand beside you as equals, trade, learn from each other, and build something that benefits both our peoples." He paused, then added with the slightest hint of a smile, "We are small, as you said, but we have found that small things can sometimes be surprisingly useful." Jael did not smile. The concept might not have existed in his culture. He studied Akapor with his burning amber eyes, and for a moment, the ambassador thought he saw something glimmer there. Curiosity, perhaps, or the slightest crack in the wall of absolute certainty. Then the crack closed. "You are amusing," Jael said. "I admit that. Your bravery is unusual for an inferior species. Most of them are already on their knees, weeping and begging." He straightened in his throne. "But bravery does not change facts. You entered the Dominion without permission. You did not bend the knee. You did not submit your genetic profiles for cataloging. This is a crime, and it will be answered for." Akapor's translator, a young woman named Priarma, leaned to his ear. "Sir," she whispered, "genetic cataloging. Our intelligence briefing noted this. It is a Velet practice where subject species provide biological samples that are used to develop control mechanisms, chemical agents of compliance designed for the species' biology. It is essentially a form of genetic slavery." Akapor's expression did not change, but something hardened behind his eyes. He had been prepared to be patient. He had been prepared to absorb insults and condescension. He was a diplomat, and diplomats understood that pride was a luxury one could not always afford. But there were lines, and genetic slavery was a line so far beyond acceptable that it wasn't even visible from where he stood. "Archon Jael," he said, and now his voice carried a different weight, still calm, still measured, but with steel beneath the warmth. "I must make something clear. My humanity will not submit to genetic cataloging. We will not bend the knee. These are not negotiating points. These are facts. What I am offering you is an alternative, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than domination. I believe this will benefit the Velet just as much as it does humanity." On the bridge of the Olive Branch, it was very quiet. Every crew member watched the hologram, watched Jael's face for any sign of how the Archon would react to the first species in 6,000 years to say no while looking him in the eye. Jael's mandibles clicked slowly 3 times. It was a gesture Akapor couldn't read, but it made the Velet officers on the screen shift uncomfortably. "You refuse?" said Jael. "It was not a question. I am offering an alternative," Akapor gently corrected. "First, there is no alternative. There never was. You bend the knee, or you are destroyed. That is the choice. That is the only choice. Then I respectfully decline both options and propose a third." Jael stared at him. The clicking of his mandibles stopped. The bridge behind him froze. Then the Archon did something unexpected. He stood up. He was massive. Even through the hologram, Akapor could feel the physical weight of him. The raw biological authority of a creature designed by evolution and perfected by technology to dominate everything around it. Jael's armor caught the light of his bridge as he stepped forward, and his voice dropped to something low and dangerous. "You propose," he said, "a third option. Third. Let me show you what I think of your third option." He turned to one of his officers and spoke one word. The olive branch shuddered. This wasn't an indirect strike. It was a glancing blow, a low-energy weapon fired from one of the Velet destroyers on the edge of the formation. It hit the olive branch on the starboard side, punched through the communications grid, peeled back whole plates of hull like fruit skin, and vented 3 compartments into the vacuum of space. The bridge tilted. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. The lights turned red, and Akapor was thrown toward the railing, feeling something crack in his ribs. Priarma fell hard to the floor and did not immediately get up. Sirens screamed from everywhere. Through the smoke and chaos, Akapor heard damage reports and realized the communication grid was gone. 3 compartments breached, emergency bulkheads closed. But the ship was crippled, and worse, the voice of his medical officer, strained and barely controlled, reported what Akapor feared. 3 crew members had died. Ensign Torres on comms, Dr. Habib in the lower lab, and Junior Officer Vami, who had been standing in the corridor near the breach when the hull opened and the universe reached in and took him. 3 people. 3 human beings who had come here carrying only the hope of saying hello to another civilization. Dead because an alien warlord wanted to set an example. Akapor stood up, his ribs screaming. There was blood on his face from a cut above his eye. The bridge was half dark, lit only by emergency lighting and the red flashing of damage warnings. The holographic projector somehow still functioned, and Jael's image still stood in the center of the room, watching. The Archon was smiling, or doing what passed for a smile among the Velet. His mandibles were pulled wide. His amber eyes glowed with satisfaction. "That was a warning," said Jael. "The next one will not miss. You have 1 hour to transmit your genetic profiles and formally submit to the authority of the Velet Compact. If you do not, I will destroy your ship and send the wreckage to your home planet as a message." He paused, then added with a touch of deep, sincere amusement, "You may call your elders if you wish. Maybe they will have more sense than you." The channel closed. Jael's image vanished. The bridge of the olive branch remained in red light and silence, broken only by the sound of sirens and the uneven breathing of frightened people. Akapor stood in the center of his broken ship. He pressed one hand to his broken ribs and wiped the blood from his eye with the other. He looked at his crew, frightened, injured, angry. He looked at the empty space where Jael's hologram had stood. He looked at the damage reports scrolling on the only functioning screen and saw the names of the 3 people who had just died. He was a man who believed in words. He had built his entire life on the idea that any problem could be solved if you found the right words. He had walked into rooms full of killers and walked out with peace agreements. He had turned enemies into partners and wars into handshakes. He believed with every fiber of his being that talking was always better than fighting. But he was not a fool, and he knew, standing among the wreckage of his ship with the blood of his people still warm on the deck, that words had reached their limit. Not because words were weak, but because the Velet didn't hear them. To the Velet, the words of a weaker species were just noise, pleasant sounds made by animals that hadn't yet learned their place. He needed to change the context. He needed to let the Velet understand that humanity's words came from a place they had never encountered before. A place where peace was not a sign of weakness, but a choice made by people who had the strength to choose otherwise. He turned to his operations officer, a steady young man named Chen, who had a wound on his arm but was still at his console. "Chen," Akapor said, "is the backup transmitter functional?" Chen checked. Yes, sir, only short range, but it can reach the fleet if we amplify the signal through the secondary grid. Good. Open a channel to Admiral Vaskis. Priority 1. Encrypt it with Protocol Omega. Chen's fingers moved. The transmitter hummed. The connection was established. Thin, weak, but there. Admiral, Akapor said into the comms. His voice was calm. His words were measured, but his hands, hidden under the console, were shaking. This is Ambassador Akapor aboard the Olive Branch. The Velet have fired on our ship. 3 of my crew are dead. They have given us 1 hour to submit to what is effectively genetic slavery. He paused, sighed, then spoke the words that would change history. I am activating Protocol 7. Send everything. The line was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the voice of Admiral Vaskis came through, steady, impeccably controlled, and colder than the vacuum of space. Understood. Ambassador, hold your position. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Akapor lowered his hand from the comms and turned to look out the cracked porthole of his bridge. Outside, the 42 warships of the Velet sat in their ring of black metal, patient and self-satisfied, waiting for humanity to bend the knee. Far away on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Ironclad, Admiral Lena Vaskis turned to her crew. Every officer on the bridge looked at her. They had all heard the broadcast. They all knew what Protocol 7 meant. Vaskis did not waste time on speeches. She had never been good at them, and there was no time now. She turned to her communications officer, a veteran named Okonkwo, and spoke 6 words. Wake the Arabus Nox. Okonkwo's eyes widened. He had served under Vaskis for 7 years and had never heard her speak that name. He had heard rumors of it, just as every sailor in the fleet had heard rumors. A ship so large it had been built inside a moon. A weapon so powerful it was classified above the clearance level of most admirals. A thing that was never meant to be used, because its use meant that everything else had already failed. He entered the command codes with steady hands and sent the signal. Somewhere, in a place that didn't appear on any public star map, something very large and very old began to wake up. Back on the Olive Branch, Ambassador Akapor stood on his shattered bridge and waited. His ribs ached, but the names of his fallen crew burned in his mind. Through the porthole, he saw the faint glow of the Velet flagship's engines, and he imagined Archon Jael sitting on his throne, confident and patient, waiting for the little creatures to realize they had no choice. Akapor had made a career out of giving people a choice. He had always believed any problem could be solved if you found the right words. He had walked into rooms full of killers and walked out with peace agreements. He still believed in that, but he also understood what pure pacifists often didn't. Sometimes, before giving someone a choice, you have to make them understand that you have a choice too. The Velet didn't know what was coming. They had spent 6,000 years at the top of the food chain, unchallenged and untouched, and they had concluded that this was the natural order of things. They believed that because they were strong, they had the right. They believed that because no one had ever stopped them, no one ever could. They were about to learn something new. Akapor closed his eyes and waited. He didn't pray, because he wasn't a praying man. But he hoped. He hoped that what was coming would be enough for the Velet to hear. And he hoped, above all else, that when the dust settled, there would still be a chance for the peace he had come here to build. The hour was expiring. The Velet waited. The Olive Branch drifted, broken and bleeding light into the void, and in the darkness between stars, something was moving. Archon Corva Jael was not a patient creature. Patience in Velet culture was considered a weakness, a quality of prey animals that sit quietly hoping the predator will pass by. Jael hadn't become Archon by being patient. He had become Archon by being fast, ruthless, and absolutely certain of his place in the universe. But he was enjoying this. The little white ship sat in the center of his fleet like a wounded bird surrounded by wolves. And the thought of the tiny creatures inside, scurrying in their broken vessel, arguing and panicking and slowly coming to terms with their new reality, gave him satisfaction that was almost physical. He had done this 43 times before. Not him personally, his predecessors, his civilization, Sho-D-Plosens, Sho-Archon stretching back 6,000 years. But the pattern was always the same. First, the lesser species would rattle their sabers, then they would beg, then they would bend the knee, and then they would serve. It was the natural order. It was the only order. The hour was almost up. JL sat in his command throne and looked at his sensor displays with lazy satisfaction. His officers stood at their stations in rigid silence, as was proper. The bridge of his flagship, Dominion of Will, was a cathedral of dark metal and amber light, built to project power in all directions. Even the air had a taste of power, filtered through systems bearing traces of chemical markers of confidence, keeping the crew sharp and obedient. Archon, his communications officer, reported. The human ship transmitted a short-range signal directed away from our fleet, encrypted. A distress signal, Jael said, waving it away with a gauntleted hand. They are calling their elders. Good. Let them come. Let them see what their children have found, and let them speak subserviently. He ordered his sensors to intentionally let the transmission pass. He wanted the humans to call for help. He wanted their leaders to come to the border, see the power of the Velet fleet, and realize that resistance was a mathematical impossibility. The more people who witnessed the submission, the smoother the transition would be. It was a lesson Jael had learned from the archives of past conquests. Break the spirit of the leadership, and the body of the civilization would follow. He turned to his second-in-command, Tae. She was centuries younger than him, star-eyed and cautious, with an analytical mind that Jael sometimes lacked. He valued her because she thought about things he considered beneath his notice, things like logistics, supply chains, and the feelings of lesser species. She was soft, in his opinion, but useful. Tiet, he said. Begin preparations for the biological cataloging protocols for the new species. Bipedal, carbon-based, oxygen, breathing. I want the processing teams ready when their leaders arrive to submit. Tiet bowed her head. Yes, Archon. She paused. The signal they sent. Should we attempt to decode it? Why? It will say what they always say. Help us. They are too strong. Come quickly. The words change from species to species, but the meaning is always the same. Fear is a universal language. Tiait nodded and turned to her console. But something about the situation tugged at her in a way she couldn't name. We, the human ambassador, tall, dark-skinned, with an even voice, did not act like other species. By this point in the process, they were weeping or screaming or trying to run. The human stood there with blood on his face and broken ribs and argued. He didn't beg, he argued, as if he genuinely believed he had the right to. It was strange. It was as if she were being honest with herself, disturbing. She pushed the thought away and focused on her work. The Archon was right. It didn't matter how the humans felt. It only mattered how strong they were, and they weren't strong enough. 53 minutes into the 1-hour deadline, sensors detected an approaching fleet. The Velet detection screens were the best in the known galaxy. They could track a shuttle across 3 star systems and identify its model by engine signature. They registered the incoming human fleet with professional efficiency. 60, 2 warships, various classes, approaching in standard formation at high FTL speed. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. Jael reviewed the data and allowed himself a low, rumbling sound of satisfaction. The human fleet was larger than the white ship had suggested, but it was nothing special. 62 ships against his 40. 2 might have caused concern if the ships had been Velet class, but they were not. They were small, primitive things, dangerous in the sense that a swarm of insects is dangerous, but ultimately manageable. His fleet could handle them without breaking formation. Ah, let them come, he said again, this time louder so the entire bridge could hear. Let them see us. Let them count our ships and measure our guns and do the math. They will come to the same conclusion as every other species. Mathematics does not lie. His officers murmured in agreement. The mood on the bridge was confident, almost festive. First contact with a new species was rare, only 43 inches 6,000 years, and it was considered a great honor to be part of the fleet that brought a new civilization into their ranks. There would be promotions and deep cultural satisfaction that the Dominion had expanded its borders once again. The human fleet dropped out of FTL on the edge of the detection perimeter. 62 ships, exactly on schedule. They held formation at a respectful distance, not approaching, not retreating. The Velet sensor officers cataloged them with onboard efficiency. Cruisers, destroyers, frigates, auxiliary vessels, nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Jael leaned back in his throne. Open a channel to the human fleet, he commanded. Inform them that their diplomatic ship has been presented with terms and that the Archon... It was Tiait. Her voice sounded different. Jael turned to look at her and saw something he had never seen on her face before. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was confusion, a deep, sincere confusion, the kind that comes from looking at something that shouldn't exist. What is it? He demanded. Sensors, Tiait said. There is something else. Jael frowned and looked at the main display. The human fleet was there. 62 contacts holding position. Behind them, at the very edge of detection range, was something else. One contact, but the readings made no sense. The sensor display flickered, trying to process the data. Numbers scrolled through values that were beyond the normal operating range. "Is it a malfunction?" he asked. "No, Archon. The sensors are working correctly. They just cannot accurately measure what they are detecting." "Explain." "The mass readings are. They are greater than some moons in our home system. The energy output, Archon. The energy signature is registering as equivalent to a small star." Cold silence hung over the bridge. Every officer turned to look at the display. The single contact was growing, approaching, and with every second, the sensor readings grew mass, energy, immeasurable scaling. Every number was wrong. Every number was impossible. Then the FTL distortion hit. It rolled through the Velet fleet like a wave, a ripple in the very fabric of space that caused all sensor arrays on every ship in the formation to overload simultaneously. Warning alarms howled. Display screens cracked. 3 sensor drones on the fleet's perimeter simply went dark. Their systems burned out from the colossal magnitude of the distortion. It was as if someone had thrown a planet-sized rock into a pond of local space, and the ripples were still spreading. On the Dominion of Will, the bridge turned red. Officers shouted, "Systems rebooting!" And through the chaos, Archon Jael gripped the armrests of his throne tightly and stared out the main porthole as something emerged from the distortion and became visible to the naked eye. The UTC Arabus Nox emerged from FTL like a god walking through a door. It was 27 kilometers long, 27 kilometers of dark, angular hull plating that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Its surface was covered in adaptive nano-armor that shifted and rippled like the skin of something alive, constantly correcting, constantly analyzing the environment. Its nose was wide and flat like a hammerhead, and along its sides stretched gun batteries kilometers long, rows upon rows of turrets, launchers, and energy projectors that looked less like cannons and more like the fingers of a clenched fist. It eclipsed the Velet fleet, not the way a large ship eclipses a small one, but the way a mountain eclipses a pebble, the way an ocean eclipses a puddle. The 42 Velet ships that, just moments ago, had seemed so massive and imposing, now looked like scattered toys floating in the shadow of something that should not have been built by mortal hands. The human fleet reformed around the Titan like an escort. 62 warships, which would have been the greatest military achievement of any other civilization, were reduced to an honor guard for what moved between them. The bridge of the Dominion of Will was quiet, not the silence of confidence, but the silence of creatures who had just felt the ground shift beneath their feet. "Archon," Tiayet said, her voice barely audible. "Full scan results." Jael did not answer. He was staring out the porthole. His mandibles were frozen. His amber eyes were locked onto the shape filling the sky like a new constellation. T8 reported anyway. Length, 27 kilometers. Mass consistent with a heavy planetoid. Power output exceeds anything in our records by a factor of 40. Hull composition. Unknown alloys, at least 3 materials we have never encountered. Gun systems. We have counted over 8,000 individual gun mounts. Shield harmonics, we cannot pierce them with our scanners. They are operating on frequencies we do not have the technology to read. She paused. Archon. This ship could destroy the entire fleet in a single engagement. Our models give us a survival probability of less than 2%. Jael said nothing. His hands lay on the throne's armrests. His claws carved grooves into the metal. On the bridge of the Arabus Nox, Admiral Lena Vaskis stood in the center of a command deck that could have housed a small city. The bridge was circular, multi-leveled, and staffed by over 300 officers working with precise, quiet coordination. Holographic displays filled the air with data fleet positions, weapon statuses, shield readings, and a real-time tactical map that showed every Velet ship as a tiny red dot surrounded by a vast blue presence. Vaskis looked at the display and felt nothing in particular. She had spent her career preparing for moments like this, and preparation had a way of burning the emotion out of everything. She wasn't excited, she wasn't afraid. She was focused like a surgeon before a complex operation, aware of the stakes, but absorbed by the work. "Status of the olive branch?" she asked. "Damaged, but intact, Admiral. Life signs are stable. Ambassador Akapor is accounted for. Good. Status of the Velet fleet? Holding position. Weapons are not charged. It seems they are waiting. They are thinking, Vaskis said. That is exactly what I want. She turned to her tactical officer. Lieutenant Commander Reese, execute Protocol 7 broadcast. Reese nodded and initiated the sequence. What happened next was not a message in the traditional sense. It was a data packet, a dense, compressed set of technical information transmitted simultaneously to every Velet ship in the formation. It bypassed their communication systems entirely, embedding itself directly into their sensor networks in a way the Velet had never encountered. Essentially, it was a forced download. The data packet contained exactly one thing: the technical specifications of the Arabus Nox. Not all of them, not even most, just enough. Weapon power, shield capacity, power output curves, armor composition ratings, drive capabilities, crew numbers. And because Admiral Vaskis believed in clarity, a simple mathematical comparison showing what would happen if all the weapons on every Velet ship in the fleet fired at the Arabus Nox's shields simultaneously. The answer, presented in pure numbers that required no translation, was nothing. On every Velet bridge in the formation, officers watched the data as it filled their screens. The numbers were unambiguous. The numbers did not require interpretation. The numbers spoke the universal language of mathematics. The thing floating before them was beyond anything they had ever built, met, or even imagined. The numbers said that the Velet fleet, the pride of a 6,000-year-old civilization, was not surpassed. It was irrelevant. On the Dominion of Will, TIE read the data 3 times. Then she turned to the Archon. "Archon," she said, her voice carrying the cautious weight of someone delivering news that might end the world. "These data are accurate. Our own sensors confirm them independently. Their specs match what we are detecting." JL's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign in Velet body language meaning extreme agitation. He had been Archon for 112 years. He had commanded fleets that burned cities and broke nations. He had never in all that time faced a problem that couldn't be solved with enough force. He was facing one now. "It is a trick," he said. "A projection, a hologram. Our mass sensors do not detect holograms, Archon. This ship is real. It is there, and it is everything the data says." Jael stood. He stood because sitting felt like submission, and Corva Jael did not submit. He paced the bridge. His heavy boots thudded against the deck like a heartbeat, and his officers watched him with eyes that had shifted from confidence to uncertainty and something very close to fear. "We are the Velet Compact," he said. His voice was loud now, filling the bridge with an authority he drew from somewhere deep and desperate. "We have ruled for 6,000 years. We do not bend. We do not retreat." "Wait, Archon," the communications officer interrupted. And the interruption itself was so unusual that it silenced the entire bridge. "The human ship. It is broadcasting. What is it saying?" The officer listened. Then he looked at Jael with an expression the Archon couldn't read because it was an expression no Velet had ever needed to make before. It was the expression of someone who had just realized the universe was much larger than they had been told. "It is saying nothing, Archon. It is not transmitting words, demands, threats. It is simply repeating its own designation on all frequencies. The designation of the ship, Archon. Simply the name, Arabus Nox." The name echoed in the silence of the bridge. The Velet didn't know what it meant. They didn't know that in the old languages of Earth, Arabus was the primordial darkness, the void that existed before creation. They didn't need to know. The ship spoke for itself. JL stood in the center of his bridge, surrounded by his officers, his fleet, and 6,000 years of undisputed mastery. He looked at what filled his porthole, at what made his warships look like children's toys, and felt something he had never felt before. He had no word for it. In the Velet language, there was no word for it, because no Velet had ever needed one. The closest equivalent in a human language was simple, and it fit perfectly: humility. He stood there for a long time. Then he did something no Archon in the history of the Velet Compact had ever done. He raised a hand, palm forward, and addressed his fleet. "All ships," said Archon Corva Jael, and his voice was quiet now, stripped of its thunder. "Cease fire." The order went out. 42 warships, their weapons ready, their crews ready. They received the command and obeyed. The guns that were aimed at the olive branch pulled away. The targeting systems went dark. The shields shifted from combat configuration to defensive. The Velet fleet held its breath. The Arabus Nox waited, dark and patient and as vast as the night it was named after. It didn't fire, it didn't advance, It simply existed, filling the sky with the simple, overwhelming fact of what humanity could build when it decided something needed to be built. Across the void, on the shattered bridge of the Olive Branch, Ambassador Idris Akapor looked through the cracked porthole and saw the Titan's shape against the stars. He didn't smile. There was no reason to smile. 3 of his crew members were dead. His ship was broken, and what he had come to build hung by a thread. But the thread was still there, and as long as there was a thread, there was a chance. He straightened his shoulders, pressed a hand to his broken ribs, and waited for what would come next. The shuttle that carried Archon Corva Jael and his honor guard from the Dominion of Will to the Arabus Nox was a fine vessel by Velet standards. It was armored, fast, and decorated with the ceremonial marks of a fleet commander. It carried the leader of 11 worlds. It had always seemed large. Now it seemed like a speck of dust drifting toward a cliff. The hull of the Titan completely filled the shuttle's porthole. It was impossible to see all of it. The ship was too large for that, too immense to be understood from this distance. JL saw only the surface kilometers of dark, shifting armor plating that rippled with faint patterns of light like the skin of some deep-sea creature waking from a dream. The nano-armor was alive, or close enough to alive that the difference didn't matter. It watched their approach. Jael was certain. The ship was aware of the tiny vessel moving toward it, the way a mountain might be aware of an ant crawling up its slope. Not threatening, not interested, just aware. His honor guard sat behind him in the shuttle. 6 warriors, the best in the fleet, dressed in ceremonial combat armor and carrying weapons blessed by the Compact's war priests. They were the best the Velet could offer. They sat in rigid silence, and Jael could feel the chemical markers they were emitting, the sharp, acidic scent of fear disguised by the bitter taste of forced aggression. They were terrified. They were well trained enough not to show it, but biology did not lie. Jael couldn't blame them. He was terrified too. The shuttle was directed into one of the hangar bays of the Arabus Nox by an automated docking system that took control of their vessel without requesting permission. The Velet pilots held their hands uselessly over controls that no longer responded to them as the shuttle was neatly but firmly pulled through a massive set of doors and placed on a landing pad inside the ship. The hangar bay itself was larger than most space stations he had ever been to. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. Rows of human fighters lined the walls, hundreds of them, sleek and angular, resting in their cradles like sleeping predators. Service vehicles moved between them in orderly fashion, driven by humans in gray uniforms who looked at the Velet shuttle with polite curiosity and nothing more. No fear, no awe, no nervousness, only the light interest of workers who had a job to do and a foreign visitor who needed to be accommodated. This, more than anything, unsettled JL. He had expected a display of hostility or, at the very least, tension. What he got was competence, calm, quiet, professional competence. These people were not boasting. They were not trying to intimidate him. They were simply going about their business inside a machine so powerful that intimidation was a secondary concern. The shuttle's ramp lowered. Jael stepped off with his honor guard. His boots tapped the deck of a human warship for the first time. The air was clean and cool, with a light metallic smell that was not unpleasant. The gravity was slightly lighter than the Velet standard. These people came from a smaller planet. A reception delegation was waiting. 4 human soldiers in black combat armor stood at attention. Their weapons were holstered but visible. They were small by Velet standards. The tallest barely reached Jael's shoulder, but they carried themselves with the casual confidence of people who knew exactly where they were and what they were capable of. An officer stepped forward and saluted. Archon Jael, the officer said through a translation device attached to her collar. Welcome aboard the UTC Arabus Nox. Admiral Vaskis and Ambassador Akapor are waiting for you in the diplomatic chamber, if you will follow me. Jael nodded. It was a gesture his species used unnaturally, but he had studied enough human transmissions to recognize it. He followed the officer, with his honor guard trailing behind him, and together they entered the belly of the Titan. The walk was long. Jael suspected this was intentional. They passed through corridors wide enough for vehicles to drive through. They passed weapons bays where massive turrets sat in their cradles, idle but ready. Their barrels were thick enough for a Velet soldier to stand inside. They passed through a section where the walls were transparent and revealed the interior of a hangar so large it housed not only fighters but full-sized warships. Human destroyers were docked inside the Arabus Nox like lifeboats aboard a cruise ship. Jael counted 6 before they turned a corner and lost the hangar from view. 6 warships, any of which could have challenged a Velet cruiser, were carrying its cargo. They passed the central reactor bay, and here Jael stopped, despite himself. The corridor opened onto an observation gallery that descended into the heart of the ship, and what he saw there made him gasp in a way no battlefield ever had. The reactor was a sphere of contained energy, easily a kilometer across, suspended in a grid of magnetic containment fields that hummed with a purity Jael felt in his bones. It pulsed with a blue-white light that was not quite even, not quite rhythmic. It moved like a heartbeat, or breathing, or something that is dreaming. The energy readings his implants were receiving were beyond anything the Velet had achieved in 6,000 years of research. "This way, Archon," the officer said politely, and Jael realized he had been standing still for almost a minute, staring. He moved on, but the image of that reactor remained in his mind, burning like an afterimage behind his eyes. His people had built great things. They had raised empires, conquered worlds, and broken the laws of physics to serve their will. But they had never built anything like this. They had never even imagined anything like this. The diplomatic chamber was located in the center of the ship, deep within its most protected section. It was a large, circular room with a high ceiling and soft, indirect lighting that cast no harsh shadows. The floor was polished to a mirror finish. In the center of the room stood a table, a simple rectangular one made of dark wood. Real wood, Jael noted. Organic material, shaped by hand, placed in the heart of the most advanced combat mechanism in the galaxy. He didn't know what to make of that. Admiral Lena Vaskis stood on one side of the table. She was smaller than Jael had expected. Compact, lean, with short dark hair and eyes that assessed him with the clinical precision of someone measuring a potential threat. She wore a simple uniform, no ceremonial armor, no decorations other than a handful of rank insignia. She didn't need decorations. She stood inside her decoration. Vaskis nodded to him. "Archon Jael, Admiral Vaskis." His voice was steady, but he was putting all his effort into keeping it that way. "You have an impressive ship." "Thank you," Vaskis said, completely without emotion. "Please, be seated." On both sides of the table stood human-sized chairs. On the other side, larger versions, clearly prepared for Velet proportions. Jael noted this attention. He also noted that the large chairs put the Velet delegates on the same eye level as the humans, not higher, not lower on equal footing. Another message. He sat. His honor guard positioned themselves behind him, standing at attention. Vaskis's soldiers did the same on her side. The two groups stared at each other across the table with the mutual fatigue of professionals recognizing other professionals. Then, from the other side of the chamber, the door opened, and Ambassador Idris Akapor entered. Jael hadn't expected this. He had assumed the human diplomat was still on the broken ship, tending to his wounds and his dead. But here he was, crossing the chamber with slow, careful steps that spoke of pain he was consciously ignoring. His face was bruised. A white bandage covered a cut above his left eye. His left arm was held against his body in a way that suggested the ribs beneath were broken or cracked. He was dressed in the same clothes as during their first conversation, torn, stained, and marked by the unmistakable brown crust of dried blood. He hadn't changed, he hadn't cleaned up, he had come exactly as he was, wounded, bloodied, and unconquered. Akapor reached the table and sat opposite Jael. He placed his hands on the wooden surface, looked the Archon straight in the eyes, and said, "Archon Jael, I thank you for accepting our invitation to continue negotiations." Jael stared at him. The human's voice was the same, calm, warm, steady, as if nothing had happened, as if the attack on his ship, the death of his crew, and the arrival of the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy hadn't changed anything fundamental about what he was doing here. "You are wounded," Jael said, because it was the only thing he could say. "I am," Akapor agreed. "3 members of my crew have died. Your ship killed them." The words hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation. Not exactly. It was a fact, presented with the same calm precision as everything else Akapor had said, but it landed heavily. Even Jael, who had ordered the deaths of millions, felt their weight. "I regret the necessity," Jael said. Jael was surprised to find that a small part of him actually meant it. "There was no necessity," Akapor simply said. "But we can discuss that later. For now, I would like to resume our conversation where it was interrupted." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small data tablet. He placed it on the table between them and activated it. A document appeared on the screen text in both human and Velet script, side by side. These are the terms I offered you aboard the Olive Branch, Akapor said, before the attack. I would like to present them again. JL looked at the document. His implants translated the text as his eyes slid over it. Mutual non-aggression with defined borders between human and Velet space, trade agreements with an initial focus on non-strategic goods, cultural exchange programs, voluntary and mutual, joint scientific commission to research areas of common interest, conflict resolution through dialogue, with agreed-upon procedures for resolving disputes. He read it twice. Then he looked at Akapor. These are the same terms, he said. Yes, exactly the same, word for word. JL's mandibles clicked. He looked at the document again, then at Akapor, then at Admiral Vaskis, who stood behind the ambassador like a shadow made of patience and steel. I do not understand, JL said, and this admission cost him more than anything he would ever have confessed to anyone. Either you bring this, he gestured widely, encompassing not just the room but the ship, the fleet, the impossible gun that surrounded them, and then offer me the same terms as before when you had nothing. We did not have nothing before, Akapor said. We had the same thing then as we do now, a desire for peace. The ship around us did not change what we want. It only changes whether we believe we have the ability to achieve it. Jael leaned back in his too large chair. For 6,000 years, the Velet had perfected the art of negotiation through strength. The stronger party dictated terms, the weaker party accepted them. It was clean, efficient, and natural. But the humans were doing something he had never encountered. They were the stronger party, overwhelmingly, absurdly, impossibly the stronger party. And they were offering terms that a weaker party would offer, terms of equality, terms that gave away the very advantage they held. Why? He asked. It was a simple question, but it contained everything. Akapor studied him for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet, as if he were sharing something personal. Archon, I have spent my life talking to people who believe that strength has given them the right to take what they want. Some of those people were of my own species. Humans have not always been good to each other. We have fought wars that killed billions. We have committed acts of cruelty that we can never fully redeem. We know what it means to use strength as a weapon against the weak, because we have done it ourselves. Many times. He paused, letting it settle. We built the Arabus Nox because we realized something about ourselves, that we are capable of terrible things when we are afraid or angry, or when we convince ourselves that our strength makes us right. This ship was not built for you. It was built as a reminder to us, a reminder of who we can become if we ever stop choosing to be better. He met Jael's gaze. I am offering you these terms because they are right. Not because we are weak, not because we fear you, but because peace between equals is the only peace that lasts. I have seen what happens when one side dominates another. It does not end. It rots. It breeds resentment, rebellion, and eventually war. I do not want that for your people or for mine. He pointed to the bandage on his face, the blood on his clothes. 3 of my crew members died today because your civilization believes that strength is the only thing that matters. I am sitting opposite you in pain on a ship that could turn your entire fleet into vapor. And I am telling you that strength is not the only thing that matters. I am offering you something your people have never been offered before. The opportunity to be something greater than conquerors. The opportunity to meet someone as an equal. The room was quiet. Even the guards on both sides stopped their quiet, professional breathing and froze. Jael sat, contemplating these words. He was not used to processing ideas that did not fit into the framework in which he had lived his entire life. The Velet worldview was simple. The strong ruled, the weak served. It was elegant in its clarity. It had worked for 6,000 years, but sitting in this room, on this impossible ship, opposite a wounded man who offered him kindness backed by the strength to destroy him, Jael felt the framework crack. It didn't break, it didn't shatter. It just cracked a thin line running through a wall he had considered indestructible. He turned to Tiait. She stood behind him with the honor guard, and her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes shone with something that could have been hope. She had always been soft, the one who quietly questioned the old ways in private where no one could hear. Now she watched her Archon sit opposite an alien who was saying things she had never dared to say herself, and she waited to see what he would do. Tiai, Jael said. Your assessment. She stepped forward. The terms are generous. Archon more generous than anything we would have offered in their place. The military analysis is clear. Their ship is beyond our ability to counter. Rejecting these terms will lead to conflict. A conflict that will lead to our destruction. But beyond the military reality? She paused, carefully choosing her words. These terms offer the Compact something it hasn't had for 6,000 years. A relationship with another species that is not built on submission. I believe it is worth exploring. Jael made a humming sound. He turned back to Akapor. Your peace, he said. If I accept it, what guarantees do I have? The same guarantees that I have, Akapor said. Your word and mine, backed by the understanding that breaking them will be costly to both of us. And if the Compact decides to expand into space that is not yours, into other regions, other species that is a decision for the Compact, and it is not part of this agreement. We are defining the relationship between humanity and the Velet. Nothing more, nothing less. Jael considered this. The human was not trying to reform the Compact. He wasn't demanding that the Velet change their ways or abandon their empire. He was simply drawing a line and saying, here, we are equals. What you do on your own time is your business. Jael realized this was the most pragmatic proposal he had ever received, and it contradicted every instinct in his ancient warrior body. Reasonably, he looked at the data tablet. He looked at the terms. He looked at the wounded man sitting opposite him with calm hands and calm eyes, and the hope of a civilization resting on his broken shoulders. Then TI-8 leaned close and whispered quietly in his ear. Archon. Long-range sensors have detected 4 additional FTL signatures converging on our position of the same magnitude as this ship. Jael's blood ran cold. 4 more. 4 ships like this. The thought was beyond comprehension. 1 was enough to finish his fleet. 5 was enough to finish the Compact itself. He didn't know, couldn't know, that the signatures were decoys. Phantom echoes projected by Admiral Vaskis's electronic warfare systems, designed to create exactly this moment. The Arabus Nox was one of a kind. There were no others. But the sensor data was perfect, and the Velet had no way to distinguish. Jael looked at the terms again, then he reached for the data tablet. I accept, he said. The words were simple, 2 words. But it was the first time in the 6,000-year history of the Velet Compact that an Archon had accepted terms from another species as an equal. The first time a Velet leader had signed an agreement that didn't start with the word submit. The first time the Dominion had drawn a border and agreed to stay behind it. Jael pressed his mark on the tablet. Akapor signed alongside him. The document was witnessed by Vaskis and officers from both sides. It was done. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was brief. There were no celebrations, no speeches, no toasts. The weight of the moment was too heavy for merriment. 3 people had died. The entire world view of a civilization had been called into question. The peace was fragile, uncertain, and built on a foundation of mutual recognition that could crack at any moment. But it was there. It existed. 2 species, separated by thousands of light years and thousands of years of different history. Then they looked at each other across the table and decided to try something neither of them was sure would work. As the Velet delegation prepared to leave, Jael stopped at the door of the diplomatic chamber. He turned back to Akapor. Ambassador, he said, I have conquered worlds. I have broken fleets and destroyed civilizations. I have done things your people would call monstrous, and I have never once lost a minute of sleep over it. He paused. But I will remember this day, and I will think about what you said regarding strength and what it is for. Akapor bowed his head. That is all I ask, Archon. Jael left. His honor guard followed him. The door closed behind them. In the ensuing silence, Admiral Vaskis walked to stand beside Akapor at the porthole. Through the reinforced glass, they could see the Velet shuttle departing. A tiny spark of light moving back toward the dark silhouettes of the alien fleet. Do you think it will hold? Vaskis asked. Akapor watched as the shuttle vanished into the distance. He pressed a hand to his broken ribs and took a slow, careful breath. It doesn't matter if they believe in peace, he said. It matters that they believe in the Arabus Nox. Vaskis looked at him for the first time since he had known her. Something that could have been a smile touched the corner of her mouth. That is the most honest thing a diplomat has ever said, she said. They stood together and watched as the Velet fleet slowly and carefully began to retreat. 6 months had passed. In the scale of a civilization, 6 months is nothing. A moment, a breath, a gulp of air, 1 tick of a clock that measured time in centuries. But for 2 species that had met on the edge of Cygnus Reach and decided not to destroy each other, 6 months was enough to begin changing everything. The Velet Compact honored the agreement. This surprised many people on the human side, including several members of the UTC High Council, who had privately bet that the agreement would collapse within weeks. It didn't collapse. The border was set. A neutral zone was defined. Trade convoys began to make cautious runs between human and Velet space, carrying non-strategic goods, raw materials, agricultural products, cultural items. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that either side would lose if the relationship collapsed. But the convoys ran on schedule and without incident. In every successful voyage, a small brick was laid into the foundation of something that, with time and patience, could become true trust. Ambassador Idris Akapor oversaw the process from a newly created human diplomatic station on the edge of the neutral zone. His ribs had healed, though they still ached in the cold mornings. The cut above his eye had left a thin scar he had decided not to remove. He wanted to remember how he had gotten it. He wanted everyone who looked at him to remember. The 3 crew members who had died on the Olive Branch, Ensign Torres, Dr. Habib, and Junior Officer Vami, were posthumously awarded full UTC honors. Their names were engraved on the memorial wall in Geneva alongside every person who had ever died in the service of exploration and peace. Akapor attended the ceremony. He stood in the front row in his best suit and did not cry. He saved that for later. Alone in his cabin, where no one could see, a diplomat could show much in public. But grief, true grief, was private. Admiral Lena Vaskis had returned the Arabus Nox to its secret birthplace. A hollowed-out moon in an unnamed system that appeared on no map. The Titan powered down. Its systems, one by one, fell silent. Its vast corridors descended into stillness. Its reactor cooled from the brightness of a small star to the faint pulse of a sleeping heart. It would wait there in the darkness until it was needed again. Vaskis hoped that would never happen. She suspected it would. She returned to active duty in the 4th Expeditionary Fleet and was quietly promoted to the rank of Fleet Admiral, a rank that had not existed before and was created specifically for her. The promotion brought a new responsibility: oversight of all Titangent-class human assets. The fact that only one Titan asset existed was classified above the clearance level of most government officials. As far as the galaxy knew, humanity had an unknown number of ships, and the UTC was happy to let that ambiguity work. The first Velet civilians arrived in human space 4 months after the Accord. They were scientists. 3 of them, assigned by the Compact to study humanity as part of a cultural exchange program. They arrived at the human colony of New Geneva, aboard a Velet courier vessel, accompanied by 2 Velet warships that lurked on the edge of the system like nervous parents watching their children enter a stranger's house. The scientists were cautious, formal, and clearly uncomfortable. They were raised in a civilization that divided the universe into 2 categories, Velet and everyone else below the Velet. And now they were being asked to treat a species they had been taught to consider inferior as something close to equals. For them, it was like being asked to take the opinion of a fish seriously. Their training said one thing, the Accord another. And the memory of the Arabus Nox, which hung over every interaction like a vast and silent shadow, said something entirely different. The lead scientist was a woman named Catharaz. She was old by Velet standards, nearly 500 years, and possessed the sharp, impatient mind of someone who had spent centuries cataloging galactic species and sorting them into categories of superiority and inferiority. Humanity did not fit her categories. This worried her greatly. "They are chaotic," she reported to the Velet Compact after the first month of observation. "Their social structures are fragmented. They are constantly arguing. They have hundreds of languages, thousands of cultural traditions, and not a single unified belief system. Their governments do not agree with each other on fundamental principles. Their history is a catalog of wars, famine, cruelty, and self-inflicted catastrophe. By all the metrics the Compact uses to evaluate the potential of species, they should have self-destructed centuries ago." She paused in her report, and when she continued, her voice carried the bewildered frustration of a scientist whose data did not support her hypothesis. "And yet, they built the Arabus Nox. They built a machine that exceeds everything we have created in 6,000 years of focused, unified effort. They built it while arguing with each other, fighting each other, while being, by all objective measures, a complete mess. I do not understand how this is possible. I do not understand these creatures at all." Her report was read by many officials of the Velet Compact, including Sub-Archon T8, who had been appointed the first ambassador of the Compact to humanity. T8 read the report, smiled slightly, and filed it into her growing collection of observations about the strange, contradictory, irritating, and, it must be said, surprisingly admirable species that the Compact had stumbled upon. Tait moved to the diplomatic station in the neutral zone, where she worked a block away from Ambassador Akapor. Their relationship was professional, cautious, and marked by the slow, uncertain process of two people from completely different worlds trying to find common ground. Akapor was patient with her. He had been patient with warlords. The alien diplomat was comparatively simple. They had dinner together once a week, a practice Akapor used as a formal way to build a relationship. The meals were awkward at first. Velet food was mostly protein-based and served raw, while human food was cooked, seasoned, and varied in ways that puzzled the Velet digestive system. They came to a compromise. Every week, one of them would choose the menu, and the other would eat whatever was served without complaint. Akapor mused that this was a reasonable metaphor for the entire diplomatic relationship. During one of these dinners, 3 months after her appointment, Tait asked the question that had been burning in her mind from the first day she had stood on the bridge of the Dominion of Will and watched the Arabus Nox appear from folded space. "Ambassador," she said, setting aside her eating utensil, a two-pronged tool she used with the delicate precision of a surgeon. "I must ask you something. It is a question the entire Compact is asking, and no one has been willing to formulate." Akapor looked up from his food. "Of course. The Arabus Nox," Tait said. "You built it before you knew about us, before you knew of the existence of any alien civilization. Your species had never made contact with another intelligent race. When construction of this ship began," she paused. "Who was it built for?" Akapor looked at Tait for a long time, and when she saw in his eyes something she had not expected, not pride, not shame, but a deep and complex sadness. "That is not a question for me," he said. "That is a question for Admiral Vaskis." Tait asked Vaskis the same question the following week during a strategic review meeting on the diplomatic station. Vaskis was not a woman who wasted words, and she did not waste them now. "For ourselves," Vaskis said. Tait blinked. "I do not understand." "The Arabus Nox was built as a deterrent," Vaskis said. "Not against aliens, but against us. Against humanity. We built it because we looked at our own history and saw what we were capable of when we turned against each other. We built it because we needed something so overwhelming, so absolute, that no faction within our civilization would ever believe it could win a war against the others. We built it to make human-on-human war impossible by making the consequences unthinkable." She met Tait's gaze. "You ask who it was built for. It was for the worst version of ourselves, the version we always fear might return." Tait returned to her room that evening and did not sleep for 3 days. She had spent her entire career studying lesser species, cataloging their weaknesses, their failures, their inevitable submission to the great supremacy. She had never met a species that frightened her. The Velet were the pinnacle. That was how it was. But now she understood what Archon Jael had understood on the bridge of his flagship while looking at a ship too large to comprehend. Humanity was not frightening because of what they could build. They were frightening because of why they built it. A species that looked at its own capacity for destruction and said, "We need to build a weapon against ourselves." That was a species that understood violence on a level the Velet had never reached. The Velet used violence as a tool applied outward against the weak. Humans carried violence inside themselves like a disease they had learned to control but never cured. And the Arabus Nox was the medicine, not soft, not kind, but effective. Such a species could not be conquered. Not because they were too strong, though they were, but because they were already fighting the worst enemy they would ever meet. And that enemy was themselves, and they were still standing. The intelligence that Tait shared about the wider galaxy changed everything for the UTC High Council. The galaxy, as it turned out, was not empty. It was full of civilizations, empires, alliances, and rivalries that stretched back millions of years. The Velet Compact, with its 6,000-year history, was at best a regional power, dominating its corner of the galaxy but unknown or irrelevant in others. There were older empires, larger federations, and species so advanced that even the Velet spoke of them in whispers. And there was a pattern, one repeating pattern, that ran through the history of every civilization. The strong dominated the weak, empires rose and fell, species were conquered, enslaved, absorbed, or destroyed. The galaxy operated on a principle as old as life itself. Strength determined everything, and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Humanity had entered a galaxy that operated on fear. Every civilization either held the whip or felt it. There was no middle ground, no third option. The UTC High Council called an emergency session in Geneva to determine humanity's path forward. The session lasted 9 days and became, by all accounts, one of the most heated debates in the history of human governance. The Hawks spoke first. They wanted to build more Titans. They wanted to expand aggressively, claim territory, and assert humanity as the dominant power before anyone else decided to test them. The galaxy is dangerous, they argued. The Velet were a warning. The next species might not want to talk, and the only way to survive in a galaxy built on fear is to become the thing everyone else fears. Then the Doves spoke. They wanted to dismantle the Arabus Nox. They argued that the weapon was a moral abomination, a monument to humanity's worst instincts, and that carrying it into the galaxy would make humanity no better than the Velet or any other conquering empire. The only way to change the galactic pattern is to break it, they said. Show that a species can be powerful without being a predator. Disarm, they said. Set an example. Trust the galaxy to follow. The debate raged back and forth, becoming louder and angrier every day. The Hawks accused the Doves of naivety. The Doves accused the Hawks of inciting war. Old political rivalries surfaced. Historical grievances were dug up. The Council, which was supposed to represent the unified voice of humanity, sounded like exactly what it was. A room full of people who couldn't agree on what to have for lunch, let alone how to navigate the most dangerous environment their species had ever encountered. On the 8th day, Ambassador Idris Akapor requested to speak before the council. He stood at the lectern in the Great Hall, a tall, lean man with a scar over his eye and a calm voice that could fill the room without ever rising above a conversational volume. He looked at the council members, the observers, the cameras broadcasting to every human world, and spoke. "I have listened to 9 days of debate," he said, "and I heard 2 propositions. The first says we must become the biggest predator in the jungle. The second says we must lay down our weapons and hope that other predators become vegetarians. With respect to my colleagues on both sides, I believe both propositions are mistaken." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "The Hawks are right that the galaxy is dangerous. It is. The Velet taught us that, and the intelligence they shared confirms it. We cannot survive by being weak. Any species that disarms in a galaxy built on violence will not last long enough to prove it was right." He turned to the other side of the chamber. "The Doves are right that strength without principle is just tyranny with better technology. If we build 100 Titans and use them to conquer, we will become exactly what we found at Cygnus Reach. An empire of fear, ruling through violence, breeding the resentment that will eventually destroy us. We have done this before in our own history. It never ends well." He placed his hands on the lectern and leaned forward. "I propose a third way. We keep the Arabus Nox. We maintain our strength. We build everything we need to build to guarantee that no one in this galaxy can threaten the survival of humanity. But we do not use this strength for conquest. We do not use it for domination. We use it to create space for conversation, for negotiation, for the possibility that 2 species can meet each other and choose something other than war." His voice became quieter, more personal, and the camera tilted to hear him. "I stood on the bridge of a broken ship with 3 fallen crew members and offered peace to a species that had spent 6,000 years crushing everyone it met. I did not offer that peace because I am naive. I offered it because I was standing behind the biggest weapon in the galaxy, and I knew that if we couldn't offer peace from that position, we would never offer it at all." He straightened up. "Humanity always reaches out its hand first, but behind every open hand stands a clenched fist. We do not conquer, we do not submit. We offer peace, and we make the cost of refusing it unthinkable. That is what I propose. That is who I believe we should be." There was silence in the chamber for a long time after he finished. Then a vote was called. The proposal was accepted unanimously, not because everyone agreed with every word, but because every person in that room, on some level too deep for politics, understood that Akapor's way was the only one that could survive in the galaxy without losing its soul. It became known as the Akapor Doctrine. Rumors didn't spread quickly because the galaxy was vast, and news traveled at the speed of ships and signals, but they spread. The Velet Compact shared it first, not out of generosity, but out of bewildered admiration. A species that could have demanded anything and chose to demand nothing was a novelty worthy of discussion. Other species heard about it through trade networks, intelligence channels, and the slow, organic process of galactic gossip. And something unexpected happened. Species that had been conquered by the Velet or other empires, or that had been hiding in the backwaters of the galaxy hoping to remain unnoticed, began to approach humanity quietly, cautiously, through unofficial channels and encrypted transmissions and couriers who traveled circuitous routes to avoid detection. And they didn't approach because humanity was the strongest. There were more ancient powers in the galaxy, larger empires, more advanced technologies. They approached because humanity was the first powerful species they had ever encountered that reached out a hand instead of a chain. The first species that said, "You don't have to bend." The first species that said the word equal and meant it. Messages came from dozens of worlds. Some were desperate, asking for help from species on the verge of extinction. Some were cautious diplomatic probes from civilizations that wanted to verify if the rumors were true. Some were simply curious. The species over there seemed to have done the impossible, and they wanted to know how. Akapor read every message personally. He answered every one. And with every answer, the network grew. Not an empire, not an alliance yet, but the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen. A web of relationships built not on domination, but on the radical, frightening, absurd idea that different species could choose to treat each other as equals. It was slow. It was fragile. It was madness by the standards of galactic politics, but it grew. And then, on a quiet morning 6 months and 13 days after the signing of the Cygnus Accords, a monitoring post on the edge of human space detected something new. It was not like the Velet signal. The Velet signal was a territorial marker, loud, aggressive, and confident. This signal was different. It was weak, buried deep in a frequency range that human technology could barely detect. It was old, not 2,000 years old like the Velet broadcast, but old in a way that made the linguists and physicists who analyzed it look at each other very quietly with wide eyes. The signal was millions of years old, possibly older. It had traveled across the galaxy for so long that it had been stretched and distorted by the expansion of space itself. Its decoding took weeks of work by the best minds humanity had to offer. When the translation was finished, it was delivered to Ambassador Akapor and Admiral Vaskis simultaneously in sealed files, marked with the highest security clearance the UTC had. Akapor opened his file in his office on the diplomatic station. He read the translation. He read it again. Then he sat very quietly and looked at the wall for a long time. The message was a distress signal, not from a ship, not from a planet, but from an entire civilization. A civilization so ancient and advanced that the 6,000-year history of the Velet Compact would be a footnote in their records. They had once been a great power, possibly the greatest the galaxy had ever known. They ruled not by strength, but by knowledge, the slow accumulation of understanding that came from observing the universe for millions of years. And they had sent this message because they were afraid. The translation was imperfect. The language was ancient and strange, built on concepts the human mind struggled to hold. But the core meaning was clear, brutally, terrifyingly clear. They are returning. We could not stop them. We could not run far enough away. They consume everything. They are patient. They sleep between the stars and wake up when civilizations become bright enough to be noticed. We were bright. They noticed. Arm yourselves. Arm everyone. It will not be enough, but it is all that is left. Akapor closed the file. He placed his hands on the table and breathed in slowly. This was how he breathed when the world pressed down on him, and the only choice was to hold it up or be crushed. Then he reached for his comms, across human space, in a system that did not appear on any map, on a ship that slept in the darkness inside a hollow moon. Admiral Lena Vaskis opened her file and read the same translation. She read it once. She didn't need to read it again. Her comms rang. Akapor's voice sounded calm and steady, as always, but with that note beneath it that she had heard only once before the day the olive branch was attacked. "Admiral," he said, "I think we need to talk." "I agree," Vaskis said. She was already walking toward the command center. Her boots echoed in the empty corridors of the moon base. Around her, the dormant systems began to hum as her authorization codes brought them online one by one. "I will contact the Velet," he said, "and every other species that has reached out to us. If this message is real, it is not a problem for humanity alone." "Agreed," Vaskis said. "I will start on our side." She reached the command center and placed her hand on the activation panel. Deep beneath her, in the heart of the moon, something huge began to stir. Power systems engaged, reactors lit up. The 2 7-kilometer dormant warship began to wake up. Its systems shifted from sleep to standby to active, with the slow, relentless pulse of a tide. "Ambassador?" Vaskis said. "Yes," Akapor replied. "The Akapor Doctrine. Reach out your hand first. Make the cost of refusing it unthinkable." She paused. "I think we are about to find out if it works on a galactic scale." Akapor was silent. Then he said, "It has to, Admiral. Because if it doesn't, I don't think there is a scale large enough for what follows next." The comms went quiet. Akapor began making calls. Vaskis began giving orders. And in the darkness between stars, the Arabus Nox opened its eyes. The hand was reached out, the fist was clenched, and humanity disordered and broken, bold and foolish, moved forward into a galaxy that was soon going to need them more than anyone had ever imagined. The night was old, the darkness deep, and somewhere far away, something was waking up. But they were waking up too.